Hello, everyone. I would like to give you a warm welcome to this year's ASCUS 2021 Edinburgh Science Festival. And this is our online programme as part of Syncrasy exhibition, which opens today at Summerhall. So we're really delighted to present Oscillations as part of this year's exhibition, which is a multimedia immersive installation. And it explores the complex interrelatedness of our physical world and the way distant or invisible phenomena, such as forces of gravity, can have a tangible effect on our day-to-day lives. So this exhibition has been created by Victoria Evans, and we're delighted to welcome her here today, along with a producer and collaborator, Javier Aregger, and also special guest Colin Shepherd from the UK Hydrographic Office. So together, they'll give us some insight into the ideas behind the work and take you on a journey through the inception of this work back in 2016, and through to today, the latest installation as part of the Syncrasy exhibition. So for today, there will be a series of talks from the creators. This will be followed by a discussion. And as part of this discussion, we'd like to open it up to the floor. So please feel free to use the chat function to send in your questions. And Sienna, who's part of our ASCUS team, will be working behind the scenes to help us weave those conversations into the event. So yes, I think to begin with, what we'd like to do is we'll present just a short excerpt from the immersive exhibition that's on right now by way of a film. And after that, I'll hand the floor over to Victoria. Okay, and yeah, you're very welcome to today, and we look forward to spending the next hour together.
Hi there. Yeah, I'd just like to add my welcome to everybody, and thanks to Miriam for organising this, and thanks for the introduction. So yeah, that video you've just seen is from the installation, which has just gone into the corner gallery. Well, the footage is actually from the other iterations of the show that we've done before, but I'm really delighted that we've been able to bring a new version of the work to Edinburgh for the Science Festival. And this installation in Summerhall also includes a brand new expanded digital element which works alongside the physical exhibition, and it now means that you can have your own personal experience of the artwork from anywhere in the UK. But I'll explain a bit more about that later. So hopefully now you can see me superimposed against an image from the exhibition. So in this first part of our discussion today, I'd just like to give you a bit of insight into my process and a lot of the thinking behind the work. Because I started on this, well, it is actually hard to pinpoint a date, and Miriam mentioned 2016, and I definitely started properly working on it from 2018, but it's gone through a lot of development, and there's been a lot of collaborations along the way that has kind of brought it to the stage it is now. So yeah, the project really started with me thinking about the moon. I think I knew in 2018 that there was an anniversary coming up for the moon landing. So it was the 50th anniversary of the moon landings in 2019. And originally I thought it'd be nice to kind of make an artwork that touched on that as for the anniversary. And I've always been really fascinated by the moon and the effect it has on our minds and our bodies. And I remember when I was a teenager and I found out that my periods were synced to more or less a lunar cycle of 28 days. And that really kind of blew me away. I mean, if you stop to think about it, it's really a bit mad. Like, how does this work? So for modern day city dwellers, you know, it can't be about the light levels anymore. So and my body doesn't know what a calendar is. So, you know, it's quite fascinating to me. I mean, there's this whole anecdotal and folkloric tradition that acknowledges the moon, you know, has an influence on us. But until quite recently, there probably wasn't that much concrete scientific evidence to back this up. And we know that, you know, evidence that emerges from women's lived experience in particular, you know, is often historically not being prioritized as a subject for scientific study. So even though the kind of, you know, informal or folk knowledge was there around this thing, it's often dismissed as being apocryphal or being old wives' tales or something like that. But recently there has been a lot more study done on subjects related to not only circadian rhythms that look at the rhythms of the daily cycles and how they affect our bodies, but also on lunar rhythms. So it's quite a lot of really exciting research in that area. But for me, you know, whether or not the precise mechanisms have been identified yet to, you know, talk about these lunar cycles, the fact that they do exist is fascinating for me. And I was looking for ways to explore this through my artwork. And I was thinking about how I could make the idea of these rather mysterious effects more tangible for myself and for an audience. And at the same time as this, I was thinking about how, you know, maybe the most obvious manifestation of the moon's effect can be seen in the tides. So Colin is going to talk about this a bit later, but tides have these daily, monthly and seasonal cycles, and in a large part this is caused by the moon. And in my mind, I can sort of see this as a sort of a seasonal dance, a kind of with its own movements and rhythms that we would be able to follow much better if we weren't locked into our own particular human timescale. So these cycles are measured very closely in tidal science, but I wanted to know if I could find a way to make them tangible in a more emotive way. And, you know, you can understand that the rhythms exist in an abstract way, but how can you actually feel them in a way that perhaps might also relate more to the experience of being next to the sea. So at this point in the process, when I was just kind of starting to think about all these ideas, I initially thought I might be going to make a kind of essay film about different cultures' relationship with the moon from a female perspective. And in early 2019, I managed to get a very small bit of funding from Glasgow Life to do a filming trip that was going to be, you know, to develop the visual aesthetic for the film. So my plan was to immerse myself in the tidal landscape and experiment with different kinds of lenses. So I went to stay in this beautiful lochside cottage on the Ardnamurchan Peninsula, can't say that, where the sea was just a few metres from my doorstep. And so I still haven't actually made this essay film about the moon that I thought I was going to make, but some of the footage from this filming trip has ended up becoming one of the video works for Oscillations. So yeah, just to explain, so I don't tend to develop things in a kind of really super linear directed way. It tends to be that I have all these ideas bubbling under in my head, and then gradually I kind of pull them together and start to make connections for them. So yeah, leading up to this time of the filming trip, I'd also been thinking quite a lot about data sonification. So what is data sonification? Well, you can think of it as a bit like data visualization, but rather than using images such as pie charts or graphs or whatever to represent data or information, it uses sound. So a really good example that most of us would be familiar with of data sonification would be a Geiger counter, for example, or a heart monitor. So I first came across the idea of data sonification probably in around 2014. There was a composer in Germany called Manuel Sept who'd sonified the oscillations of the comet 67P. I don't know if you remember that. There's a little image here of it. It was the one that they said it looked like a duck, but I think it looks like a little earpiece to me. But anyway, he managed to kind of translate this into sound, and I thought that the results were just so beautiful and haunting, and actually used them in an art installation previously, but I had never thought, or I've never tried to make my own data sonifications. And I had no idea how to do computer coding or anything like that at the time, so I just approached it in a very basic manual way. I googled the Tide Times website. You can see an image of a tide chart. So that's a visualization of tidal data there. Yeah, I googled this Tide Times website and I laboriously wrote down all the measurements and times of high and low tides for a whole month. And then I decided on a musical transposition for this, which I felt would be able to show clearly enough the fluctuations in the tide over time. So it worked out as something like your 10 centimetres of height change would be another note on the musical scale. And then I figured out a time signature as well that meant that a month of real time would be correspond to a minute of musical time. Yeah, so that I had the notes occurring at the right appropriate time scale within that. Yeah, and I also decided to stick to the key of C major. It's not exactly precisely relating to the heights. I mean, some of the notes in this scale will be half tones and some of them will be whole tones. So this is why I refer to it as a musical data sonification rather than a scientific one. And I can talk about that more later if anyone is interested. Yeah, I knew that tides were distinctive to different areas. Each place has its own particular tide timetable. So I wanted to know if this idea of sonification would work for different locations, and whether it would result in, recognizably different melodies. So I repeated this process again, like laboriously writing out these measurements for two other locations, which were Arbroath and Lochmaddy. And, I found that I could hear the difference, and it was subtle, but there were these melodic changes. So people seemed to find this interesting. So I kind of wanted to pursue this further. But yeah, obviously doing this manually was unbelievably time consuming. And I knew I had to either learn a lot about computer coding very fast or find someone to work with who knew how to do this. So I'd been involved in this Pint of Science events where they were bringing artists and scientists together, and through them I got in touch with a professor in Glasgow Uni called Steve Brewster, and I found out about him through a visually impaired researcher who was using who was using sonification as an alternative way to observe the universe, and she's really fascinating. So if anybody wants to know more about sonification, I would really recommend her There's a recent BBC Sounds podcast that's just come out where she talks about her work. It's really fascinating. But anyway, Professor Brewster put me in touch with another of his PhD students, because she had left by this point, who was called Jamie Ferguson, and he did the coding for me. But then in the course of our working together, I became really interested in research he was doing about sound and touch. And he was, so we started working together to develop a sculpture where you could actually hear the sounds of the tides, through your hands. So this is some images of us exhibiting that at Pint of Science. Right, I'm nearly finishing. So at that exhibition that you saw there, that's where I actually met the producer Javier, who's with us today, and we have continued to work on developing the installation ever since, and that's what is now in Summerhall. So I've talked for quite long enough, so I'm going to hand over to Javier, and he can talk a bit about how the process proceeded from there.
Yeah, so like Victoria was saying, we first met at the Pint of Science event in Glasgow, and at the time I'd gone back to uni to do a curatorial master's course at the Glasgow School of Art. So I was kind of looking for a project I could work on, and because I've got background in both sound engineering and visual art, I've always been drawn to sort of exploring this sort of relationship between sound and visual art, and I'm also very interested in this idea of multisensory installations, and perhaps what you could call experiential art, for want of a better expression. And in my case, it would involve producing or sort of orchestrating, as it were, a work. And hopefully, when you put it together, it's more than the sum of its parts. But yeah, above all, work that people found engaging. So then I went over to see Victoria's piece, which at the time was a short audio piece and was a haptic element, like Victoria was saying. And I think perhaps what first attracted me to the work, beyond the concept of sonification, which is very intriguing in itself, I think it was the short sound piece that was, because the way it's been created, it sort of unfolds as a melody over time, just like Victoria was saying. Time is sort of compressed, as it were, but it does unfold in time as a melody, and I thought it was sort of strangely moving. So I told this to Victoria and kind of started working from then on. I knew she wanted to incorporate other elements to this, video and haptic elements and so on, and perhaps develop this as an installation. So basically, I just we started talking, and we decided to do it as an installation. So I'm not sure if you want to say anything at this point, Victoria.
Yeah, no, I mean, because my recollection of it is really that you were quite instrumental in kind of pushing me to develop those other elements, because I know that I had that in the back of my mind, but I think in the timescales that we had working together initially, that I was probably quite resistant to it at first. I was like, oh, can we just do a sound piece, because I've got that, and I do think that you sort of have this way of working with me, which is quite sort of like, you sort of gently keep asking, and then
it's kind of the instigator, yeah, really.
Yeah. And certainly maybe you can just mention explain what haptic is, and mention the seating in the
perhaps if I kind of bring it back to what I was doing at the time, and what I'm kind of doing now, because as a producer, I suppose I'm dealing with the presentation of the work and elements which are, sometimes practical or technical in nature to sort of realize a project. But there's always a bit of bouncing ideas back and forth, and as the installation takes shape, one of them was that haptic element and how to realize it in the installation. The installation itself relies a lot on technology, the current one. There are also, sculptural elements and so on. But whenever technology is involved, I suppose you can use it as a tool, but also as a sort of source of inspiration, and kind of encouraging serendipity, as it were. So I think there's always an overlap between kind of the technical and the more conceptual and curatorial elements. They're all there in the same pot. So one of the important elements of the installation is the sound, and kind of that's in a way how it all started. So that key element has always been there, but it's now played through 8 individual loudspeakers. So each individual sound corresponds to an individual speaker, and you can think of each one of them as a separate instrument, as it were. Now, each sound can be heard at a particular location within the installation, and one of those sounds is not necessarily heard but felt through what you call tactile transducers, which is effectively under the seating areas. And a tactile transducer, it's basically like a loudspeaker, but it plays back sounds which are below the human hearing range. So you actually feel the sound in your body. And the rest of the sounds are sort of heard in the normal way. But that was always an important element of the installation. That's something that goes back to those experiments Victoria was doing back then in 2019. So it's something that I think we sort of discussed a lot. And then in terms of how the installation is put together, I think another important element is sort of having a number of distinct areas or viewpoints for the audience to sort of navigate and experience. But also kind of from my perspective, making sure that everything comes together as a whole, the work comes together. So I think one of the key challenges is bringing all these elements together, video, light, sound, sculptural and haptic elements, from the original concept to each physical space, to create that sort of immersive experience. And I think it has always been the case, but for Summerhall, I think the light is very important. It's a great space to work with, but the light really sort of opens up and creates spaces within that gallery. So it gives each piece a sort of unique character, and how the sculptural works are presented and how they interact with the light is also key, I think, and how the sound and the video are positioned, so that that experience shifts gradually depending on where you are in the gallery. From my perspective, I think that the key, and I guess for you too, is like bringing all the elements of the installation as a whole, and creating that opportunity for people to experience it.
Yeah, and this time it's also kind of moving beyond the gallery space, which is quite an exciting change for us. And we're about to hear from Colin about the tidal data that he supplied for the part of the exhibition that we haven't mentioned too much yet. So I'm just going to show you a couple of images that should give you an idea of this. Basically, this is a browser-based app experience where you can, which allows audience members to generate their own tidal melody, you know, similar to the way that we've done it for the installation, but it would be unique to the location and the date that you've accessed the work remotely. So just to kind of give you a very quick overview of like why this came about, it was really very much driven by when the pandemic hit and we were all just tied to our computer screens, and this exhibition that we're now able to put on was cancelled. It was due to happen in April last year, and there was a real kind of problem of like not being able to show artwork, but also when you could show artwork, it was just images and it was just everything being tied to the computer screen. So I thought it would be great to have some kind of artwork which would not only release you from the computer screen, but would allow you to kind of go outside and experience art in a different way. So I'll just run through quite quickly just the different elements of the app. So yes, it will allow you to generate, you'll be able to hear your own tidal melody from the place that you're in. There's an interactive element, so as you move your phone, you can mix between the tracks that correspond to either the tidal melody or the presence of the sun and the moon in the sky and the phases of the moon, what have you. And there's a final part of the artwork, which is a map of the UK, where when you've accessed your local coastal region, it will the Tidesong that you've generated will then appear on a map related to where you access that. I mean, it's we're not collecting any data about you, and it's all completely anonymous, and you can choose to bypass this part of the experience if you want to, but I think it's quite exciting to be able to see this evolve over time, related to how people have interacted with the artwork. And then we're also inviting people to share images or thoughts about their experience with others, and so that there's kind of hopefully a sense of connection there as well, that you know you can do this as a meditative experience on your own or with other people. But importantly, this couldn't have happened without being able to access like an incredible amount of data from around the UK that relates to the tidal predictions. And so this is where Colin at the UK Hydrographic Office comes in, because they really kind of did, we had a kind of conversation and with them, and you know they were able to supply data for this project. So we're very lucky to have Colin here today. He's going to give us a little bit of insight into what the UK Hydrographic Office does and what he does. So over to you, Colin.
Thank you, Victoria. Yeah, so I've got a short presentation that I've put together, which hopefully won't last more than about 8 or 10 minutes, just to go through some of the concepts, some of the important features of tides, particularly with interest to the moon and its effect on tide. After all, without the tide, I'd be without a job. The tides would be very easy to predict because they would just follow a solar pattern and not a lunar one. And this will cover, as I said, an introduction to the Hydrographic Office and the tide section. I'll talk about what causes the tide, how we measure the tide, and how we crunch the numbers, how we analyse the data to finally come up with the predictions. So starting at the top of this slide here, we've got hydrographic surveys, specifications and validation. So we're the tide section in the centre here, and these bubbles around the peripheral are what we do essentially. And just to explain, hydrographic surveys, this is the measurement and depth of the seabed, called bathymetry. In order to create charts that have safe depths on them for navigation, that's essentially what the hydrographic surveys are for. We provide guidance to the surveyors and survey companies on procedures and specifications, and assess the tidal data collected from those surveys. Next, along to the left, tidal analysis. This is where we assess the tidal observations that we receive and run the data through analysis routines to produce sets of harmonic constants. The harmonic constants are held in our database and used to generate tidal predictions. Next bubble there, products and services. We produce tidal predictions in many different formats depending on the products. Largely the predictions make up our Admiralty tide tables, you may be familiar with. But they also find their way into other products, including navigational charts, tidal stream atlases, and for use in our tidal application planning interface, the API. This would have been the route by which we supplied the data for Victoria's Tidesong Arts installation. Project support, that small bubble just up there. This is how we support other areas of the business in developing new innovative products that utilise the tidal data, such as heights, streams, levels, datums, all that sort of thing. Information about availability and quantity of the data, that sort of thing. The bubble down at the bottom that I missed out there, IHO representation. That's collaborating with international bodies such as the International Hydrographic Organisation, the IHO, offering professional advice and guidance, helping to agree internationally recognised standards and practices. Advice to UK charting teams. This is where we help our teams within the organisation so that they can put the correct tidal data on their charts to make sure it's accurate and up to date. This helps, excuse me, yeah, this is the information that's collected in the hydrographic surveys, which I mentioned earlier. So the next slide will go straight into a short video, which I explained at the start. This explains the interaction of the sun, moon, and Earth system, and how the sun and moon affect the tides that we experience.
Let's say this is our Earth. There it is. So if there were no objects around the Earth exerting a gravitational pull, the water would be uniform around the Earth, like so. There would be no tides. But there are objects around the Earth. We've got the sun, which is really big, so it has a big gravitational pull, but it's a long way away. The moon is much smaller, so it has a smaller gravitational pull, but it's very close. That means the moon is the biggest influence on our tides. So let's get rid of the sun for a moment so that we can consider this relationship between the Earth and the moon. And what's going to happen now, the moon's going to pull on the tide, and we're going to end up with a high tide on the part of the Earth that's closest to the moon. So as the Earth turns, the Earth's going to turn through that bulge of water, which is the high tide. Now, there's another high tide on the opposite side of the Earth. And that's because the Earth and the moon wobble around each other, and there's a bulge of water thrown out on that side of the Earth, as well as the tide that gets pulled up by the moon. But why is it that we get our biggest tides at the new moon and the full moon? Let's bring back the sun. And what you might notice is that now we've got an alignment between the sun, the Earth, and the moon. And that means the sunlight is actually shining past the Earth to light up the full face of the moon. That's what a full moon is this alignment. It also means the sun's pulling the water this way, the moon's pulling the water that way, and our tides end up being bigger than usual. And that's what we call spring tides. Now, these spring tides also happen at new moon, when the moon is between the sun and ourselves. So again, alignment this way and alignment that way both create spring tides.
So how do we measure the tides? And we've got two different types of tide gauges in common use. The first of these is the direct pressure transducer. That's the image just to the bottom right of the screen there. That's placed in the water and must be submerged in water all the time so that it doesn't dry out when the water disappears from the harbour or the wall. It measures the depth of water over the top in terms of pressure and translates that pressure into a height or a depth. The other type is a radar gauge which measures the distance from the transducer face down to the water surface. So where do we get these measurements from? Various different sources. As mentioned earlier, hydrographic surveys, the Royal Navy do surveys for us. The Civil Hydrographic Programme, civilian contractors also doing surveys for us. We get information data from foreign government hydrographic offices, port and harbour authorities, commercial companies, in particular wind farms, and from academia. This is typically what water levels look like when we get the data in. You've got several lines of header information there, details about the site of the gauge, the calibration, the location, that sort of thing. And the data itself, the important data, the stuff that we're interested in the first three columns there, the date, the time, and the height. So before we analyse the data, it's got to be pre-processed. We've got to inspect the data and make sure that there are no gaps. We have to take out any sort of bad data, like gaps, spikes, jumps, missing data, generally just checking the health of the data itself. We use dedicated software to do this. And then we run it through the analysis. The purpose of the analysis is to identify harmonic constants that are required for calculating the tidal predictions. So just a little bit of background on harmonic constants. They can be thought of as representation of naturally occurring forces that generate the tide. The origins are related to the theory of simple harmonic motion, and the definition of which is a periodic motion where the restoring force and the moving object is directly proportional to the object's displacement, magnitude, and acts towards the object's equilibrium position. So, well, what that means in the context of tides, the periodic motion is caused by the gravitational attraction of the sun and the moon. The initial displacement and restoring force are caused as a result of the Earth's position relative to the sun and moon. This sets up tractive forces on the surface of the Earth which allow the water to flow across its surface and create tidal flow. So what you can see there is an observed curve. It's an oversimplified and exaggerated tidal curve made up of a small number of tidal harmonics or curves, A, B, and C that you can see there, and E and F. They're separated out of that main curve that you can see on the left. So the aim of this analysis is to separate those curves, as I said, and make up the observed curve by deconstructing it. In this case, the observed curve can be separated out or deconstructed into three respective simple harmonic constants. Each of these specific amplitudes or height above the below, or height above or below the 0 point, in other words, and frequency, i.e. how many cycles occur in a given period of time. When the individual components have been identified, we can rebuild or reconstruct or predict the curve using the known harmonics. So in other words, A, B and C go to make up D at the bottom there, E and F make up G. When we've completed that analysis, we need to graph the results against the observed data, the original data, to make sure that the fit is good and that the analysis routine has done what we expect it to do. So with the predictions, every year the Hydrographic Office produce updated tide tables, which include predictions based on the latest set of harmonic constants held in the database. In this case, we produce, well, in total, rather, we produce 9 volumes, but the highlighted panel there covers the 2 areas around the UK. And lastly, the UK tidal application planning interface. That's the method by which we produce, which we supply most of our predictions now. That would have been the route that was taken to supply data to Victoria for her project. And that's it.
Thank you, Colin, Javier, and Victoria. It was really great, yeah, to hear how the evolution of work has progressed kind of across the years and across different iterations in different spaces and places and through these partnerships. So yeah, so there's time now that for the last kind of 15 minutes so that we can have some conversation and discussion around some of the ideas. But I'd also like to just let all of you know, our audience, please feel free to add any questions that you might have into the chat. There's some questions that we're going to start prompting, but we'll see if we can weave in some audience questions as well. Yes, so I guess just to kind of kick things off a little bit, Victoria, and you spoke about this earlier, that kind of at the inception of this work was maybe 2016, 17, 18, yeah, not really sure, but I guess, yeah, my question was, is this an intentional part of the way that you work, that the work itself seems to have its own legs and its own yes, kind of life of its own, in a way that you kind of coax or guide?
Absolutely, yeah. I don't kind of really plan what I'm going to do usually, which is I'm actually doing a PhD at the moment. That can be quite problematic because the sort of structures that you're fitting into are kind of sometimes planning structures. But for Tidesong, the app-based research, I did actually that was quite planned. That was what I would think of as quite a design process. But even within that, I mean, the part of my practice is really about taking advantage of the kind of accidents that happen and seeing what feels right. It's quite an intuitive process, and I sort of, yeah, I have to kind of see how something is before I know what I want to do with it. And it's always a process of kind of getting close to something and then going, oh yes, that's that feeling that I wanted. And I don't necessarily always know what it is I'm looking for until I find it. But there's also this other process that goes on of kind of constant layering. You could see there that I was talking about these 2 almost separate projects that ended up coming together to create Oscillations. And I never know, I just get really fascinated in things and I pursue them, and then they sort of end up, oh, I can fit that in here and that can be this, so it's quite a chaotic but intuitive guided process, let's say.
And yeah, and I think so yeah, Javi, obviously you kind of came into the project as part of this kind of organized, evolving evolution of the work. And in terms of your practice as a producer, it feels like, and especially through the latest iteration as part of the Syncrasy exhibition, that you've been able to kind of really indulge those kind of immersive interests that you have in terms of the sound and these kind of haptic technologies. So it'd be interesting to hear how kind of this collaboration with Victoria has maybe influenced your career as a producer, or your ways of working.
Yeah, I think in terms of way of working, it's just kind of deepened my interest in the whole idea of, you know, immersive experiences, and I think we both kind of share this with Victoria, in that the current iteration at Summerhall is such a great space to work with, and you can. It really makes all the work come together really nicely. So, you know, very square room, really tall ceilings, and it works acoustically, works visually. Yeah, it's a very interesting space to work in, and you know, every time you use a different space, then it triggers different, you know, ideas and different things.
And how about you? How about you, Victoria? In terms of this install in Summerhall, has this changed how the work physically, how it sits in the physical space?
Definitely, because we're dealing with spatial sound. The actual, literally the space you're in is completely changes how you would hear the work. In particular, I was really attracted to the corner gallery at Summerhall because when I first walked into it, I felt like it was like a swimming pool, because it just has this very kind of deep shape to it, and I could immediately feel that this was going to work really well for the work. So it's quite different, because another iteration we did was in a 2-room space, and another was a much larger sort of theatre space. So they all have their very, very different characteristics, and this one is maybe more of a centered kind of experience where you can still walk around, but there's this sort of feeling of being very much inside something, which is interesting, and totally relates to what Javier's saying about the immersive feeling that you get from it.
Great, and we have a question come through from one of our audience members, and it's directed to you, Victoria. So you mentioned that one of your inspirations for this project was syncing between women's periods and the lunar cycle. Is that something you're thinking about exploring further in your work? Thank you, Rachel, for that.
Yeah, I think it will come in somewhere, because it's, you know, I'm not sure if it's ever going to come in directly and this is really always the case in my practice, that I might think of a kind of subject area initially, but I don't really, my work is never going to be kind of head on dealing with an issue or a subject in that way. And, you know, because I'm not that kind of filmmaker or artist, like where I would actually kind of approach things in a kind of documentary sense in that way. So that really explains why I haven't made that film I was talking about earlier yet. But I do think it will come into something again. And, you know, I can't say exactly how, but I haven't let go of that idea at all. And I think there's going to be something happening around that, but it might not be identifiably as I've explained it there, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question, Rachel?
And then we have another question that's come through from Chris, and they've asked again, Victoria, do you see yourself doing more marine themed projects in the future? Yeah,
I do, but again, probably not in a kind of directly environmental or kind of natural world sort of sense, but I'm really interested in, there's a lot of thinking that goes on in kind of feminist thinking about metaphors of water and different ways of being and different ways of knowing and fluid, and there's a whole kind of area there that I'm really fascinated in. So again, I'd like to touch on that, and I have got a film project in my mind that I don't know if it's ever going to happen, but which kind of might have some marine imagery, at least some more stuff and that. So we'll see. But yeah, I don't know yet, really.
Great. And yeah, I think it would be nice to talk a little bit more about Tidesong, because obviously that's the kind of newest iteration as part of this work. And yeah, Victoria, just in terms of this idea of using technology to extend the work to an app using this data, how did this come about? Because it has been this immersive experience up until now, but this new app is a very kind of digital, technological, advanced piece of the work.
Well, the tools for accessing it are, so like obviously having to, I worked with a company called Ray Interactive to develop the work, and I know absolutely nothing about the nuts and bolts of making text. So this has been a real, steep learning curve for me. So it is very technological in its making, and that's been difficult for me because I'm usually very hands-on. There's been a challenge to kind of step back and direct a process rather than actually do it myself. But I hope that the experience is actually a lot more analog than that. I mean, the kind of thinking behind it was, as I said before, that, to get people out on a beach, listening to something, and, maybe kind of allowing the environment to creep into the experience. So it is very location based. That's the ideal scenario for it. We'll see whether it actually works, because we're literally still finishing it this week and it launches next week. So I'm kind of, my guess, your guess is as good as mine at this stage of what it's actually going to be like to experience it. But yeah, that's the thinking. So it's a kind of analog experience facilitated through technical means. That's maybe the idea.
I guess this is where this work, Victoria, and kind of Colin comes together, because Colin looks at this data regularly. This is the data that he's kind of caretaker of and explores as part of his work, and it's this data that has made kind of this app, Tidesong, possible as well. And so someone has asked from the audience a question to you, Colin, and do you know if the UK-wide data is being collected collectively in real time anywhere and visualized in 2D? So I guess that's kind of a bit of trying to get a bit of an understanding about, so Victoria, how did Victoria access this data? Is it open? Is it openly accessible? So maybe it kind of relates to that.
It's an interesting question, because we're undergoing some development in the office at the moment where we're trying to upload real-time data. There's actually a slight delay in it being real-time, but the idea of having real-time data is to better forecast rather than predict what the tide is going to do over a short period of time. And that helps a navigator on a ship to be able to get a more accurate picture of what the tide's doing. But in terms of offering that up to the public, that may come too. It's definitely something that we should be, probably are looking at. But for the moment, the main route to the public is through the Tidal API, which is effectively a way of accessing the data held on our database and uploading it. So we have in place at the moment something that's winding down. Really, it's a prediction service, a free prediction service called EasyTide, but I'm reluctant to sort of plug that because we're phasing that out in favour of this other system.
We're coming close to an end. But yeah, I think one thing would be nice that I guess joins all of you together, this idea of sonification and kind of harmonies and this kind of translation of data. So yeah, I guess Victoria, I did just a question. This sonification of data is central to Oscillations and Tidesong, so both of these. And can you kind of talk a little bit about more of what you think, what insights can maybe come from this translational work using sound?
Well, I think it's really seems to be gaining ground in science as an alternative to visualization, because with any sensory engagement with the world, like what you get is dependent on the parameters of those senses. So for example, the idea is that, you know, actually your ears are really, really good at picking up certain kinds of patterns that, you know, especially amongst like vast amounts of data that are not so easy to pick out visually. And then visual means that, you know, offer you something else. So there are different things that you can observe when you're, or perceive, shall we say, when you're hearing to when you're seeing. So I think in science, it has like really clear uses, you know, just to kind of expand the range of what people are able to perceive about the world. But for me, from an artistic point of view, I kind of think I'm you know, again, it's just a way to feel what's going on, because I find the whole, I'm not very good at understanding data or seeing patterns in it myself. My brain doesn't work that way. I'm quite physical in my approach to the world. And for me, sound is a really physical phenomenon. So it helps me to kind of connect to my emotions and to my body and like feel data in a sense, which otherwise would be completely abstract for me.
And I guess, Javier, you know, is there anything that you would like to add, you know, in terms of your focus on sound and the creation of this 8-channel experience as part of Syncrasy? Well, what do you think are the insights that can be gained from using sound in this way?
Well, you know, like Victoria was saying, it's a very interesting way of looking at data, because your brain tends to pick up on certain patterns. And I think the main difference between, you know, noise and what's perceived as music is that repetition or the creation of a pattern, which is something that you would recognize in data. So I think that is a really nice thing that is transferred over from music into the interpretation of data through sonification. But yeah.
And maybe yourself, Colin, you know, I know you've experienced Victoria's app, did some trial runs with it, but you know, from your perspective, kind of working in the data in this more raw format, what do you think are the benefits that from sonification and this translation into other forms?
It's just a completely different way of looking at the data. I'm so used to looking at the data and just crunching numbers. It's an interesting way and a much more refreshing way of thinking about the data and thinking about how the moon affects the tides in particular.
Great. Well, listen, I think that's us kind of coming to time. But I'd just like to thank you, our audience, for coming here and joining us on this virtual event. And I really would recommend that you check out the exhibition. It launches today and it continues until the 11th of July. So it's open daily from 12 till 5:30. So check it out. It will continue till September, but it's daily at the moment. And also Tidesong, I think there's a soft launch of it today. Is that correct, Victoria?
It should be open. Yeah, we'll see. But yeah, you might want to give it a few days for us to finish it.
But yes, but definitely have a look at it, check it out. But we're running a launch event next Saturday. So if you want to check it out with hopefully lots of people in Edinburgh and maybe across the UK or the world, to see if people can go and use the app together, that's on next week. So do join us for that collective coastal experience through technology. But yeah, I would just like to really bring today to conclusion to say thank you, Victoria, Javier and Colin. It's been really fantastic having you. I'd like to say thank you to Sienna behind the scenes, who's the one letting you all in. She's keeping us all on track. So thank you, Sienna. And then to the Summerhall teams at Edinburgh Science Festival for helping us to get this physical exhibition happening, which was on pause from last year. So yeah, do check us out online and check out the other events that we're running. But yeah, we hope to see you soon. So thank you all for joining us.